Okay, so that's a very broad question. So what happened, I think, the first engagement with the Enlightenment happened during my PhD years, and it came to me as a historiographical problem, basically, because I worked on the, let's say, Republican thinker and political activist Andrew Fletcher of Saale, who had been considered thus far one of the pivotal figures of the Scottish Enlightenment, but he lived in the late 17th century. So in a way, what I had to do is to try to see how far his legacy would actually meet with the Enlightenment values. And this was a big debate in historiography back then. So my first engagement was with the Scottish Enlightenment and with moral philosophy, political economy, and historiography of the Enlightenment as such. Then I moved to 18th century studies through my participation in EUTech, which is a European translator in the 18th century, which is a huge database created by Anne Thompson and Halle Castagnino, which gathers all of the most obscure translators of European texts in the 18th century. And this led me to have this kind of double perspective in a way. First of all, this European global perspective, this bird's eye view over different national cultures, because of course I was working on translations from French to Italian or German to Spanish. It was very very transnational as an approach. But on the other hand, I also had to deal with local contexts, so the local enlightenments and how they connected and communicated between each other, how knowledge was circulated back then. And this gave me a very strong understanding of what the Enlightenment is for me. And then I came here to Izea in the last couple of months, where I started to realize there is as big as a debate for what the German Enlightenment in itself is, and its values and its setting. And I came to realize how much the social dimension of the Enlightenment also matters, especially in Germany with the incredible number of universities in the 18th century, how the setting compared to Parisian salons, for example, changed, and how this influenced the production of ideas and works in the same period of time. So this was more or less my career path thus far, and how it engaged with the Enlightenment all along. So again, probably as a philosopher I would give a different answer, but as an intellectual historian, which is the way I was trained, I believe that the one way we can define the Enlightenment to be sure of giving an accurate definition is as a historical construction. So it's kind of a category, a tool that we can use to analyze a certain period of time. It's a way to periodize history, just like the Renaissance or the Rinascimento in Italy, for example. One thing that is different is that the Enlightenment is connected to a set of values, but I would rather say questions that were shared by different people at the time, and that all somehow revolve around the idea of how to better the condition of man on this planet, right? One way or the other. Could it be political economy? Could it be by promoting free speech? I don't know, religious toleration, this kind of concepts. But I believe that the main question can be in a nutshell, what is progress? What is the definition of progress? So this would be like the most common answer that I can think of. But then, from a more personal side of the question, I would say that I believe, and I realized this through my career path, that it is very important to stress how much the transnational dimension has a weight in defining those debates, which are often multicultural, multi-confessional, multilingual. And the only way to actually understand even better what the Enlightenment is would be to keep pushing in this direction. And transnational kind of perspective on the Enlightenment would be very useful. This one is complicated. So again, as a historian, I don't know whether one can draw parallels between the Enlightenment as a historiographical category and nowadays issues or problems. How can those let's say solutions or the ideas that were promoted and elaborated in that time can be applied to today's predicaments. The problem with that is that we could end up giving a very presentist interpretation of the Enlightenment, which would be wrong from the perspective of an historian. But then what is actually interesting is that it is the connection, I think, between Enlightenment and modernity, this idea that the two are intertwined, that provokes this kind of idea that the Enlightenment still matters, right? We have to find the meaning in the Enlightenment to study it today. But as an historian, again, it's not so much searching why that period of time matters. It's more about trying to reconstruct how people thought in that period, how they elaborated those solutions and why, and what forms of discourse they were using, etc., etc. Well, I mean, I think the history of the term itself is pretty sound. It has been reconstructed in a way that is pretty sound. The point is rather that up until the 50s, again, it was pretty simple. You had Paris, where the Lumière happened, then you had German universities with the Aufklärung, and that was it. And then you had visiting scholars basically coming and going to the centers of the Enlightenment. So it was a concept which was also geographically very clearly defined. Then in the 60s, I'm thinking of Franco Venturi, for example, and other historians started to develop national enlightenments to the point where the category is so wide-stretched that it's difficult to use it to define something properly. I'm thinking also of the idea of trying to extend it to outside of the European borders, which is a little bit wrong, I think, from an historical point of view. Then, if we talk about the values, you know, the idea of like the values they carried, then it's a different discourse. But from an historical point of view, I think we reached the limit of how much we can stretch the idea of enlightenment. And I think some projects that are trying to apply it to China or India, that is a bit problematic to me for now, but yeah. Well, as a concept, I think that if one keeps in mind the idea that it is an historical category, then I don't think it needs more clarification than that. If one is able to somehow use it as this kind of framework, right? For further analysis. In that case, I think it works. The guiding thing is a little bit more complicated for what I said before. It's complicated also because, and this might sound a bit Frankfurt School, I think, but it's difficult to think of the idea of progress the way it was formulated in Enlightenment to be actual for today's world problems, in a way. The whole idea of economic progress, in a way, and the birth of capitalism and liberal economy is something that we try to implement, and we kind of reach the limits of it. So this is just one example to say that I don't know whether one can use those guidelines. One way this could work, though, is that in a way the construction of the category, the historical category of the Enlightenment happened in the 50s and the 60s. And it was, in a way, a reaction to the Second World War and all the ideologies behind it, so nationalism and racial theories and all that. So in a way, what could be a guideline is the fact that in order to find a better past back then, this whole category was created. And today, by using gender studies, post-colonial studies, all that can create another kind of category that we could use as historians to retrieve a better past. So the process of the creation of the Enlightenment as a historical category can be an inspiration for today's problems, I think. That would be a guideline I would follow.